Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today. As we record this today, it is December 2025, and the holiday season is in the air around us. Just yesterday, as I was coming back from the grocery, I passed by one of that most iconic of the December holiday season icons, the Salvation Army Red Cauldron for donations. Salvation Army, of course, is a charity, a nonprofit organization established to do social good within the country. We like charities. Charities are good things. Charities are organizations that I think most of us can agree are phenomenally net positive for the people they service and for the society at large. But charities have a very curious set of circumstances around them that makes them uniquely susceptible to some challenges that government entities, corporate entities, and for-profit entities don't face. And because we like to assume the better good when it comes to charities, it's very easy to overlook them. The unfortunate truth is there is a long history of problematic behavior on the part of different nonprofit entities, and the space in which they exist almost seems to facilitate this. This is probably not by design. This is probably a happenstance of how things evolved over history, all with good intentions. But it doesn't remove the conclusion that nonprofits and charities within the United States have the potential for great malfeasance. This is a consequence of different things: the regulatory hodgepodge that they exist within, the sense of identity that donors tend to wrap themselves up in when they make contributions, and the imperatives that exist around management of these organizations. Today, what we want to do is look at how do these all manifest into the competitive behavior landscape that nonprofits and charities exist within, and what kind of risk domains do they face? Rich, I know that you and I have discussed this at length in our own conversations over the last several months. And frankly, I'm kind of at a loss for where we would even begin with this, because there are so many interesting and notorious examples. There are so many odd legal structures that only exist within this space. Where do we even start?
I would like to start not with a specific case because, as you pointed out, John, there are just too many to go through. And I think our audience can easily Google or use AI and obtain a laundry list, sadly, of many such cases. So rather than point out where the malfeasance has occurred, I want to touch a little bit on something you brought up in the opening, which is the unique nature of charities and of donations and of giving. And I wasn't going to go here, but again, I just want to say for our audience that we don't script this. We have research done. John and I do our own individual preparation. So what I'm about to explore, I wasn't planning to explore. But one of the wonderful things about doing this podcast is that this is a conversation between me and John, just to be clear for everybody. So one of the things that you triggered here, John, is this idea of giving without necessarily expecting anything in return. And whether that in some way impacts the risk profile and the underlying behavioral tendencies and expectations that go on when a charity solicits from the public and when those of us in the public domain donate to a charity. And specifically, I was thinking around the whole concept of reciprocity, which we highlight quite a bit in our textbook, and we have talked about in other presentations. It is a cornerstone of human behavior that goes back millennia. And I just wonder, and I want to throw this back to you, John, do you believe the nature of reciprocity in human behavior, the fact that if I give something, there's some sort of expectation of something back, does that in some way, shape, or form with the nature of the donor charitable organizations, does that have some play here? I don't know if you've given that any thought.
I have. And I would assert that it absolutely does, although perhaps not exactly in the way that you're thinking about it. You used an interesting phrase when you were opening this up, giving without expecting anything in return. And I would argue that from a behavioral sense, the only time we ever give without expecting anything in return is when we have a habitual or overlearned behavior, something that we've just adopted into our routine that we do automatically. I think for most people, donating to a charitable cause is not a habit. I'm aware that there are some people who set up regular automatic deductions from their paycheck so that they don't even see it. It's no longer a choice. And in this case, yes, you could argue that they are giving without expecting anything in return. But the sorts of things like, for example, when we donate to the Salvation Army when we're walking out of the store during December, I don't think that people do that because they're not expecting anything in return. Now, I think it's very clear that people are not expecting any immediate material gratification. They're not expecting any necessarily elevation in social status. What they get in return is perhaps a sense of well-being. Perhaps it's a sense of moral elevation. Perhaps, and honestly, I think this happens far more often than we would like to admit, they are getting an easing of their guilt that they should be giving and they're not. I think that probably drives the overwhelming majority. And it's not a coincidence that you see so many charities soliciting at the exits of stores, at the exits of high-end stores in particular, as people come out
Mm.
having made unnecessary expensive purchases. So, do people give without expecting anything in return? I would say no. I would say most of what we're talking about, most of what we see, there is something that is expected implicitly in return, but it is not something that's going to come to their bank account. People don't expect that it's going to come to their bank account. People don't expect that it is going to materially improve their lives. It's something internal. And that makes it even trickier and even more problematic and can create some even more difficult to circumvent or difficult to countermand incentives that can very often lead to either A, problematic behavior on the part of organizations, or B, continued donations even after bad behavior has been discovered.
Yeah, so you've touched on a number of interesting things that intertwine with aspects of behavior that we've talked about at length for the last several years. One is this idea of, okay, you're going to get something back, but it's not going to be something in your bank account. It's not even necessarily going to be something related to your reputation, unless, of course, you're giving millions of dollars to some sort of foundation or worthy cause and you're going to get some recognition in some way, shape, or form. Most of us, that's not going to be the case. So, what is it? And I guess I think back to my own experience, and that's really all I can draw upon is this valence. As I understand it, as you've explained to me, it's the most powerful behavioral force that is related to our consciousness, that in some way is related to our prefrontal cortex, that supersedes thinking. So I just think about, and you brought up earlier about how for most of us, giving is a specific choice. So if giving is a specific choice, it is something that's coming from a conscious act, then it would seem to me that it would largely rely upon our feelings. And yes, guilt is definitely, I think, a big driver of it. I think also there's a feeling of pride and ego from quote unquote doing the right thing and being the next Ward or Wally Cleaver in terms of doing right by your neighbor and looking beyond oneself. That is something that is interwoven all the religious faiths and is very much a big part of maintaining the fabric of society together.
I agree with that, but I would assert that the driving motivation for many people goes even deeper than that. I would assert that there is a dopaminergic drive in
Mm.
much of the donation that we do. Wolf Schultz might disagree with me, but as I see it, we all have some sense of self-identity, a self-concept that we believe about ourselves. This is the kind of person that I am. And I think most of us want to believe that we're good people. When we walk past that charity bucket and we don't donate to it, when we don't contribute, very often that goes directly against the self-concept that we have, that I'm a good person who cares about people. And this can create what you and I have talked about in very different contexts in the past, prediction error. This creates a mismatch between what we expect to happen and the outcome that we observe. And a negative prediction error results in decreased level of dopaminergic transmission. We don't like decreased dopaminergic transmission. I've made this point in many different contexts. This is biochemically equivalent to cocaine withdrawal. Now, the magnitude, of course, is much, much less than being in cocaine withdrawal, but it is a dopaminergically mediated process. And this means that it's even more, I hesitate to use the term pernicious because that kind of implies automatically that there's something nefarious or problematic, but it is deeply entrenched. And so long as we have this idea of self-identity, I think there's always going to be a dopaminergic drive for charitable contributions.
And I believe our personal self-concept, the idea of it has evolved. It has become something that has been transmitted through generations of human existence. And I personally believe that it is a construct that helps the species survive and flourish. So I think the fact that we do this donating and it meets with our own personal self-construct that, hey, I'm a good person. I think that's all with the underlying design, whether conscious or maybe subconscious, of moving the human species forward. That is at least what I'm taking today.
I don't really have a problem with any of that. I think that it's very clear. I'm going to come back to one of my favorite topics, which is evolutionary imperatives for behavior. I think it's very clear that the notion of ego, as you describe it, is something that makes social organization possible. It creates a sense that we need to contribute to the group to keep things going forward. And this is because, from an evolutionary standpoint, we are more likely to survive if the group is doing well, and we don't want to be cast out by the group because that creates big problems for us. Where things can potentially go awry is the fact that this sort of ego imperative, this alignment of identity and self-concept with group participation, really developed within the context of small clan-sized groups, 2 to 300 people. And when you had basically line of sight onto every other member of the group. That's not the world we live in today. And most charitable organizations we have very little direct connection with. We know the name, we know the logo, we know the cause or purpose that they exist for, but realistically speaking, do we know who the management is? I like the idea of what the Salvation Army does. I don't know the name of a single person on their board of directors. I couldn't even tell you the name of the local chair in the Boston area. And so creating a strong ego alignment with the Salvation Army, and I keep coming back to this because it's the most obvious charity I can think of in the moment, but creating a strong alignment of my own self-concept with them is easily exploitable. And I think that's a big part of why and how we see many of the instances of bad behavior on the part of these organizations.
I agree with that. And it's part of being alive. And maybe in some ways, it's a reflection of being a victim of our own success as a species, of having now billions of people in the world. And we both live at or near highly populated metropolitan areas, myself in the New York City area, you in the Boston area. So everything we do to some degree feels faceless in some way, shape, or form in terms of organizations that we deal with, organizations that we buy from, organizations that we work for. These are all aspects of living today where there is this sort of mass bringing together of people into various types of institutions, and that includes charitable institutions, which makes it far more difficult to do personal due diligence on what these organizations are really about and understanding the underlying character of their leadership.
And the consequence of this is that we do our due diligence as donors by feeling. We do it by vibes. And this creates some really interesting outcomes sometimes. And I use the term interesting from the academic sense, which usually means something weird and bad has happened that makes behavioral scientists and social scientists go, "Oh, that's cool." I must confess that I have to be very careful when I say that I get excited about, like, when I say that I get excited by the consequences of COVID, that doesn't mean I liked COVID. That just means that there were some really interesting consequences in a behavioral sense. That's what I mean when I say there's some interesting things that happen with both the charitable organizations themselves and the donors very often because of this, because of doing due diligence by vibes. I'm remembering a specific case that we looked at with the United Way decades ago when we were doing our prep for this. And one of the things that I found really interesting is that even after overt documented malfeasance was revealed, there was no question of any sort that embezzlement had been done, that senior leaders had been lining their pockets with charitable donations. Donations really didn't drop off all that much. People kept giving the same way that they had always been giving. And this comes back to that issue of aligning your identity with a particular charitable donation and wanting to be a good person. If we believe that we are doing good by donating to an organization, confirmation bias absolutely comes into play. When bad things come out, we're not going to believe it. We're going to choose to disregard those pieces of information because accepting it means accepting an attack on our own character, on our own sense of who we are. And I know this sounds very wishy-washy Freudian, but it's not. This is directly alignable with most behavioral neuroscience. And people will absolutely ignore, pretend it doesn't exist, or even argue against documented instances of illegal or unethical behavior regarding organizations that they personally support.
And I'll just say, in my experience with United Way, I've given for many years to United Way. I'll just be forthcoming about that. And my initial giving to United Way was in large part due to my prior employer that was a corporate sponsor of United Way. And I'm not sure if they are today, but for many years, I'll just say this, the company I worked for had a United Way week where employees would rally together. People from the local United Way chapter in the New York City area would come to the company. We would hear from them. We'd hear some of the stories of the good they were doing with the donations that were being made. We'd start there in the week, and then we'd create a whole bunch of fun activities for employees to get involved in. We would do spoofs on various game shows to raise money from our fellow employees. So it wound up being not just giving, but a celebration of our corporate community. And that was an incredibly powerful influence on not only my giving, but certainly the giving of many of my coworkers. We raised hundreds of thousands of dollars every year doing that through these various activities in a 1 week span. And I'll just say this, being part of that kind of being part of planning committees, being part of these giving events, we now feel part of it. We feel like we are part of that charity. And to your earlier point about ego and connection and all of that, as some of this bad news was dripping out about United Way, it was like, okay, there's some of this going on, but the people that I'm meeting from that organization all appear to me to be authentic. And from all accounts, were authentic. And I think that gets to something that I did want to address today with you, if we can just segue a little bit, which is when there are rogue characters in an otherwise good organization versus other organizations which are just essentially set up as Ponzi schemes or whatever you want to call them, but they're just fraudulent by nature. And I do think there is a clear and distinctive difference between the two.
I agree entirely. And I would argue further that there is an additional layer with regards to the rogue individuals within otherwise decent organizations. And it's something that you and I have explored in a number of different episodes around corporate malfeasance, which is the difference between somebody who comes in with bad intentions versus somebody whose ethics gradually slip along the way. And it's very difficult to know in many cases. I think it's impossible to know most of the time which of these two instances a bad actor is. We like to think that charities draw good people and that maybe they just lost their way. But at the same time, because of these dynamics that you've been discussing, that we've been discussing to this point, charities are highly leverageable and exploitable by people who have bad intentions from the start. And so it's really not unreasonable to think that a bad actor might aspire towards a leadership position or a financial management position within an existing organization because of the opportunities they could get from such.
Yes, these organizations are unfortunately exploitable by people who may not have the best of intentions. We've done a previous podcast on sociopaths, and as I was doing my preparation, one of the first thoughts I had was, wow, these things are absolutely set up, unfortunately, to be exploitable. It's like a bunch of sheep, and there's a wolf sitting out there ready to just come in and take advantage. And without really strong governance and oversight, it's just ripe for these types of events. And I believe that's why, unfortunately, we've seen way too many of them over the past decades.
Agreed. And when we look within the United States, what we largely mean by this is 501c3 organizations. The space almost seems purpose-built to facilitate bad behavior. One of the things that I found really interesting in digging in on this and doing our research is the fact that the regulatory landscape for 501c3s is phenomenally inconsistent. There's huge amounts of variability state to state. And then within different states, there are different revenue and asset thresholds that change reporting requirements. This superficially makes sense, but it also means that if you are someone who's trying to take advantage of the system, you have clear and well-defined KPIs and thresholds of I need to operate within these parameters and I'm not going to be audited. This is, I can't think of another space where you can basically purpose build your revenue structure to avoid audit.
Yeah, that is something that in just is a red flag for potential scandal and exploitation. Yeah, I don't know of another industry. I don't think in the for-profit space it would be tolerated in any way, shape, or form, at least not here in the United States or most of the well-established Western powers. I just don't think it would happen in any of those countries in a for-profit sense. But in a charitable sense, yeah, it's almost as if I don't want to say a blind eye, but there is a trust element in how these organizations are overseen. And I'm not sure what the solution is because, again, I don't know, given all of the issues going on in many governments at local levels, whether it warrants a lot of attention or would get a lot of attention. So that's my personal thinking about it. One of the things I did want to talk about a little bit are some of the risks that charities face in and of themselves. And I do believe that the risk profile of charitable organizations does contribute to some of the problems that we've been discussing here on this podcast. First off, financial risks, and in particular, sourcing donations. So sometimes it may feel, and especially this time of year when I don't think there's any channel or even any streaming device that includes commercials where you won't find some major charitable organization making its wholehearted pitch for your hard-earned dollars. And that's fine. I've made my peace with it years ago. And because of that, because of the ongoing need for money, and let's be clear, I mean, these organizations are trying to raise money, they are doing things for good causes. It is always going to be at the front of what they do is fundraising. And that's why you have other organizations like Charity Navigator and others that will look at certain measures like how much of spending is based on fundraising versus going to the actual causes that they're supporting. And that's always a tricky measure, and there's some blurring of lines in terms of certain expenses that they have. But at the end of the day, the sourcing risk is a big risk. It's arguably the largest risk for any organization because they can't do what they purport to do without getting the funding. And that brings into play, I think, some other things, which is diversification of sources. So we talk all the time about diversification of revenue for-profit organizations, that if you're getting too much revenue from one revenue source, that what happens if you lose that source? It's no different for the charities. And in some ways, it's maybe even more pernicious with charities because in some cases, depending on who a concentrated donor is, who they represent, the donor may use their charitable dollars to perhaps manipulate or in some way affect the messaging, even perhaps affecting the operations of the charity because they're hanging out there this dollars that they're willing to contribute.
I agree with all of that, and I would assert there's an additional layer of, let's call it, forecasting risk that follows directly from everything you've just laid out. The sourcing risk, the revenue risk, the donor risk, and this being that all of these streams of money that charities rely on, that are their lifeblood, do not come in homogeneously across the year. There are distinct fundraising cycles and peaks. And right now, I've not seen the numbers across the board, but I know for a fact that many 501c3s, possibly most 501c3s, do 40% or more of their revenue acquisition in November, December. This means that you're relying very closely on the forecasting that you have, and you have to make assumptions. You have to make assumptions about a lot of your operating budget coming in. And if the landscape changes for any reason at all, whether it be we go into a recession or there's bad publicity or some other cause rears its head in a way that draws attention and wallets elsewhere, you can find yourself in a very, very problematic position. And this, I think, facilitates a lot of potential bad decision making if your actual intake does not land where your forecasting said it would.
Yes, these organizations are going to be building their plans around how much revenue they anticipate with the understandable operational decisions of how much to take in terms of anticipated funding and placing it in a particular project or sending it to certain institutions that are representative of the kinds of causes that they're supporting. So that can be very, very problematic and sad in some ways because in some cases, there may be, for example, homeless people or others that are counting on that money. And what a sad thought that these folks may not be able to get the dollars that they need to continue to survive. So just a sad thought there, but it is clearly a big risk in terms of meeting the objectives that these organizations are trying to achieve.
And something that honestly is just occurring to me right now as we're having this conversation, I hadn't thought about this before, but it popped to my mind as you were speaking. Something that's interesting about the fundraising that 501c3s and charities undertake is that it is completely separated from usual notions of supply and demand. There's no real supply of any sort. They're not selling anything. They're, for lack of a better term, they're begging. That's maybe not the prettiest term, and it's not precisely correct, but they're holding out their hands and asking people, please donate. there's no product. They can't increase their efforts. They can't increase their supply. They can try to do marketing. That's really what most fundraising activities are. But normal economic laws don't really apply here. And the reason I think this is consequential and what just occurred to me is that this means all of your financial and then subsequently operational planning isn't just subject to, but depends on confirmation bias and optimism bias.
Both of them matter because people want to believe in what you're doing. They want to believe that what you're doing is reputable. They don't know who you are. They don't really know who you are. They only know what you represent through your branding, through any advertising you do, any messaging that is on your website or that you make in terms of certain events that you sponsor. That's why, in fact, I think a lot of the lavish spending that often gets called out, even on some of the better charities, there's sometimes some very lavish spending. I get invited to some pretty ritzy events that I don't go to for what it's worth. And I do say to myself, wow, I wish they were using that money in other ways, but I also get it. I also get that they have a messaging and that some of the realities of what they're trying to do is to create an image of what they're about. And in some ways, that's really what we're giving to. We are giving to an image in our minds of what these folks represent. So, John, related to what we've been talking about in terms of strategic planning is operational execution. And in this sense, charities are really no different than for-profit organizations in many cases, and in some ways more vulnerable, both in terms of the frequency and severity of potential operational risk events. So some of the ones that I've just ticked off here, we've already touched on fraud. And fraud can come from mostly internal, but can also be external if, again, you have a donor that is looking to use one's position, or you have a vendor that's looking to get something out of the relationship they have with the charity. So that's one aspect of it. Others I just wanted to touch on are data breaches. There's no entity today that I know of, for profit, 503c, the underlying tax code is you're under, that isn't subject to some type of data breach type of thing. And most of these charities keep extensive lists of their donor base, of the individuals who give to them. And that's certainly ripe for exploitation. And I can't imagine that many of these charities necessarily have the latest and greatest in terms of cyber protection. So when you are giving online, which I have found to be much more convenient, to some degree, you are putting some of your information, if you're using your credit card or whatever, you're putting that out there with a certain amount of risk. And then there's just other common things like litigation, because not everything that they do, even well-intentioned stuff, may not always come off as planned. There can be injuries. There can be broken promises that lead to litigation. All these types of things crop up. You mentioned regulation, John. And while I think the regulation in general tends to be softer and can be exploited, there are also compliance issues for many of the well-meaning charities that aren't looking to exploit loopholes around the rules. So there's ongoing compliance challenges. And then I just want to touch on one significant one that, again, connects back to fraud, but I think is bigger than that, which is volunteers. These organizations not only rely on money, but they rely on individuals giving their time. So again, one of the things that I experienced and that I enjoyed a lot about my former employer's relationship with United Way was being able periodically to get involved and volunteer some of my time. And I found that to be, in some ways, more rewarding than the actual fundraising activities we did themselves, because you really felt like, wow, I'm here doing some good. I'm here not just doing something to line my bank account. I'm doing something that hopefully will leave a small mark and make the world a slightly better place. And that is a big aspect of what charities do rely on. They do rely on the goodwill and time in particular and good intentions of volunteers. And that's also a very volatile resource. Volunteerism is only going to exist to the extent that people have the time and inclination to do so. And if they're worried about their paycheck, if they've got to work another job or they've got to do other things to make ends meet, then that's time they're not going to have to volunteer.
I also see an additional layer that maybe isn't exactly operational risk, but a layer of risk that emerges because of the nature of nonprofit operations. You indirectly touched on this in discussing volunteerism, the fact that many of these organizations rely very heavily on volunteers to support or really enable what they do day to day. And this supports a larger theme, which is that most nonprofits in the United States are operating on a comparatively tight budget compared to for-profit entities. And this means that they can't be quite as choosy about who they work with and who they contract with. There's, of course, always going to be due diligence, but I'm aware of an organization in your neck of the woods. I'm not going to say who because this is not calling anybody out. It's just illustrating a broader premise where they have to push down a lot of their on the ground work to only nominally affiliated parties. And it is known by people on the ground in New York that these people who actually implement their work on the ground don't always do it the way that they should. And oftentimes will sell things that they're supposed to be giving out for free. All of this creates enormous reputational risk because of the way that nonprofit operations just have to occur. Reputational risk, of course, is a problem for any organization, but I would argue that it is uniquely problematic for charities because of that whole notion we already described that normal laws of supply and demand don't apply to them. They don't have a product. If you are a nonprofit, you can't just sell another updated iPhone to bring your customers back. Apple has all kinds of reputational breaches all the time, but they just roll out another product and people forget. Charities can't do that. And so any kind of reputational damage is going to linger far longer than it might for a traditional for-profit entity.
Yeah, I agree. That is a big problem. There is really no way you can only allow for time passage, and hopefully during that time passage, no other type of malfeasance occurs, so that over time, your reputation will gradually, at least to some degree, be repaired as people move on and deal with whatever is going on in that present moment. A couple of other things I just wanted to touch on here a little bit related to operational, and then I want to turn back to governance and some of the potential issues going on with the governance of these entities. I want to talk about the boiled frog issue. So, again, because many of these organizations can't afford to spend a lot, even on their own full-time staff, even paid staff, if you're working at one of these charities and you're being paid, you're most likely not have a huge pay packet. You don't expect to have a huge pay packet. That's not why you took the job. However, you're a human being, and there may be a temptation for, maybe sifting off a few dollars here, making use of some of the charities' existing machinery or other things that seem very small. And I would imagine the culture is one of understanding, and there's almost okay, we're not paying you a ton of money. So, if you're sifting off a little bit here in terms of your expense report, or a little bit there in terms of usage of charity assets, then that's okay. And the only problem with that, as I see, I shouldn't say the only problem. The problem with that in general is that it can lead to a snowball effect of, well, where do you draw the line? Where does something go from being a minor lapse and forgivable lapse to one of, okay, now we're really exploiting our donors and their goodwill. And I think that can definitely be problematic for many of these organizations. It may lead to a culture of expectation that I should have this extra compensation because you're not giving it to me formally. So I have this opportunity to take it. So I do think that's also a potential problem here. And let me turn to one other thing I just wanted to touch on before we wrap this up, which is the governance of many of these well-intentioned institutions. Just because someone has founded a charity doesn't mean they own it. It just means that they founded it because they were inspired to do so. And presumably, in most cases, I would think, inspired to do so for good reasons and with very good intentions because they saw an opportunity, they saw a need for this type of institution and its purpose and what it could accomplish. So once somebody finds something, once they start it, then who gets brought in and how they get brought in and how decisions are made becomes, I think, more sketchy in general. And I think that's one of the other issues that sometimes gets lost in all of this and can be frustrating for donors like you, all of you out there, which is, okay, well, who do I blame? Who has the bottom line? Who has the underlying accountability? And where is the charter document that says who's going to do what and who will be responsible that funds are used in an appropriate way? And I think, unfortunately, in many cases, that's not necessarily the case going on.
Yeah, those are all really great points. I think it just really captures the whole complexity and difficulty of the charity slash nonprofit slash 501c3 landscape that we live in and that they exist in. It's a tricky world. We like to think that they are going to universally do good, and probably on the balance, probably even in the vast majority of cases, they do. But there are lots of situations in which charities can intentionally or unintentionally do bad things. There is a unique set of risks that they face that other organizations do not face. And we as donors have to think about them very differently than we do any other sort of organization under consideration. So if there's a lesson here as we look at December, although this will probably be coming out in January of 26, it's don't wrap up too much of your identity within an organization that you donate to. If you're running a charity, don't try to run it like a for-profit. And when you're doing due diligence, don't do it by vibes. It's a complicated space, and the risks associated with the nonprofit space really are their own thing. Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.